Chapter 14. Creating a Supportive Workplace. The early morning light filters through your workspace window as you settle into your daily routine. Whether you're in a bustling open office, a home workspace carved from a spare bedroom, or a hybrid arrangement somewhere in between, your surroundings are quietly orchestrating an intricate psychological symphony that shapes your experience throughout the workday. The desk that supports your labors, the lighting that illuminates your tasks, the acoustic landscape that either cradles or fragments your attention. These elements form what environmental psychologists call your psychological workscape, a sensory reality that profoundly influences both productivity and well-being. Creating a truly supportive workplace involves far more than assembling ergonomic furniture or adding a few plants, though these elements certainly matter. It requires understanding the subtle yet powerful dialogue between your nervous system and your surroundings. A conversation that affects cognitive performance, emotional equilibrium, creative capacity, and interpersonal dynamics. By developing greater awareness of this dialogue, you transform from passive occupant to active curator of an environment aligned with both professional objectives and psychological needs. This chapter explores practical strategies for creating workplaces that genuinely support human flourishing, whether you control an entire facility, manage a departmental space, or simply have authority over your immediate desk area. Unlike approaches that treat workers as standardized units requiring uniform conditions, we'll examine evidence-based principles that honor individual differences while acknowledging shared psychological needs. Through this exploration, you'll discover how relatively modest environmental modifications can create significant shifts in daily experience, transforming hours of depletion into opportunities for engagement that honors both productivity and well-being. The psychological foundations of workplace design. Before exploring specific strategies, understanding several foundational principles of environmental psychology creates valuable context for workplace transformation. These principles explain why identical spatial conditions often produce dramatically different experiences for different individuals, and why technical optimization alone rarely creates truly supportive work environments. The person-environment fit dynamic. At the heart of workplace psychology lies what researchers call person-environment fit, the degree of alignment between individual needs, preferences, and characteristics on one hand, and environmental qualities on the other. This fit represents not a static relationship, but a dynamic conversation that shifts throughout the day as both personal states and environmental conditions evolve. The concept of person-environment fit helps explain why standardized workplace solutions so often fail to create optimal conditions, explains environmental psychologist Dr. Michelle Chen. What supports focused attention for one person may create overwhelming stimulation for another. What provides energizing sensory engagement for someone might trigger distraction for their colleague. These differences aren't mere preferences, but reflect fundamental variations in nervous system processing that significantly impact performance and well-being. Research increasingly demonstrates that these individual variations include sensory processing patterns, with approximately 15 to 20% of the population showing what researchers call high sensory processing sensitivity that creates greater responsiveness to subtle environmental stimuli, both positive and negative, attentional styles, with some individuals thriving in environments supporting sustained, narrow focus, while others function better with conditions allowing periodic attention shifts across broader awareness fields. Restoration needs, with significant differences in both the type and frequency of psychological recovery periods required for optimal functioning across different individuals. Temporal rhythms, with genetic variations creating individual differences in optimal times for various activities, from analytical problem-solving to creative thinking to social engagement. Understanding this individualized landscape helps explain why organizations that once sought universal design solutions increasingly embrace what workplace researchers call activity-based working, providing diverse environmental options that support different activities and preferences rather than expecting identical conditions to serve all purposes and people equally well. The 3 pillars of psychological workplace support research in environmental psychology identifies 3 fundamental dimensions that collectively determine a workplace's psychological impact: territorial integrity, sensory nourishment, and cognitive emotional support. These dimensions operate as interdependent systems rather than isolated factors, creating either harmony or discord through their combined effects. Territorial integrity addresses what environmental psychologists call psychological ownership. The sense that you have legitimacy, security, and appropriate control within your work environment. This territorial dimension influences fundamental feelings of safety and belonging that form the essential foundation for more sophisticated psychological functions. Without basic territorial security, the nervous system remains partially occupied with boundary maintenance, diverting resources from higher cognitive functions. Research demonstrates that territorial satisfaction significantly correlates with job performance, stress reduction, and organizational commitment across diverse workplace types. These correlations remain significant even when controlling for factors like role autonomy, compensation, and interpersonal relationships, highlighting how fundamental territory needs are to workplace psychology. Sensory nourishment involves what neuroscientists call environmental enrichment, the provision of appropriate sensory stimulation that supports nervous system health through meaningful engagement with surroundings. This dimension addresses the quality, variety, and appropriateness of sensory information available within work environments, recognizing that the human nervous system evolved to function optimally within setting providing rich but coherent sensory experiences. Studies consistently demonstrate that sensory-impoverished work environments, spaces lacking natural light, visual complexity, acoustic texture, or natural elements, correlate with higher stress markers, reduced job satisfaction, and diminished creative performance compared to more sensorially nourishing alternatives. These findings reflect what neuroscientists describe as environmental malnourishment, the subtle but cumulative effects of sensory deprivation on nervous system functioning. Cognitive and emotional support examines how environments either facilitate or hinder specific psychological states and functions essential for workplace activities. This dimension addresses how spatial arrangements, sensory conditions, and environmental cues work together to support different cognitive modes, from analytical focus to creative exploration, from collaborative synthesis to restorative contemplation. Research increasingly demonstrates that environments providing appropriate support for diverse cognitive and emotional states show significant advantages across multiple performance measures compared to environments optimized for single functions or lacking intentional alignment with psychological needs. These advantages emerge through what cognitive scientists call processing fluency effects, the reduced mental effort required when environments naturally support rather than hinder intended psychological states. Together, these three dimensions create a foundation for understanding how workplaces shape psychological experience through multiple complementary pathways. By addressing all three dimensions rather than focusing exclusively on isolated factors, workplace transformation approaches gain substantially greater effectiveness through what systems theorists call synergistic intervention effects, improvements that multiply rather than merely add when applied together, creating personal territory in any workplace context. Even in the most open and collaborative work environments, your nervous system requires some sense of personal territory, a psychological anchor that provides security, identity expression, and a foundation for engaging productively with shared spaces and activities. This territorial need doesn't reflect antisocial tendencies, but rather represents a fundamental psychological requirement for optimal functioning in social environments. Understanding workplace territoriality. Psychology. Research in environmental psychology reveals that territorial satisfaction in workplaces significantly predicts job performance, stress levels, and overall work satisfaction, even when controlling for other factors like salary, role autonomy, and interpersonal relationships. This connection exists because personal territory provides what psychologists call environmental self-efficacy, confidence in your ability to manage and influence your immediate surroundings. Territoriality operates through multiple psychological mechanisms that collectively support workplace well-being. Identity anchoring allows you to express aspects of your authentic self through personalization choices that create continuity between your work environment and your broader life context. Studies demonstrate that environments containing personalization elements, even modest markers like photographs, meaningful objects, or chosen desk accessories, measurably reduce stress biomarkers compared to identical spaces lacking personal elements. Stress regulation benefits emerge when you have some environmental control that provides respite from the demands of shared social spaces. Research shows that workers with access to personalized territory demonstrate approximately 20% lower cortisol levels during challenging tasks compared to those working in completely standardized environments without territorial accommodation. Cognitive restoration occurs when personal territory offers familiar, comfortable elements that reduce the mental effort required for environmental adaptation. Studies suggest that workers with established territory require significantly fewer attentional resources for environmental monitoring, freeing cognitive capacity for actual work tasks rather than continuous spatial adaptation. The absence of adequate workplace territory creates what researchers call environmental learned helplessness, a gradual erosion of confidence in your ability to influence your surroundings that can extend beyond workspace to affect general feelings of agency and control. Conversely, appropriate territorial satisfaction supports what environmental psychologists term place attachment, positive emotional connection to your work environment that enhances engagement and reduces turnover intentions. Understanding these territorial mechanisms allows more conscious creation of personal workplace domains that serve genuine psychological needs rather than merely reflecting aesthetic preferences or status competition. The goal involves establishing appropriate territorial boundaries while maintaining collaborative openness, creating what workplace researchers call balanced territorial ecology that supports both individual security and group cohesion. Territory creation in different work contexts. While territorial needs remain consistent across environments, effective strategies vary significantly depending on workplace type, organizational culture, and individual role. Research supports several context-specific approaches. In traditional offices, traditional workplaces often provide the clearest territorial boundaries, but may still benefit from thoughtful personalization and control enhancement. Effective strategies in these environments include boundary clarification using what environmental psychologists call territorial markers, elements that communicate territorial boundaries in psychologically meaningful ways beyond mere physical separation. Research demonstrates that even subtle territorial markers, changes in desk accessories, small personal items, or distinct workspace organization create measurable increases in perceived territorial ownership. These markers function through what sociologists call symbolic boundary communication, nonverbal signals that establish social expectations about space usage and access. Control enhancement through thoughtful addition of elements that increase environmental influence even within standardized settings. Studies show that incorporating adjustable elements, task lighting that supplements overhead illumination, personal comfort items like cushions or footrests, desktop plants that create micro-environments, significantly increases territorial satisfaction even when macro environments remain largely fixed. These adjustable elements provide what psychologists call control touchpoints, specific aspects of environment that respond to personal preferences, meaning infusion through selective incorporation of elements connecting the workspace to broader life values, relationships, and aspirations. Research demonstrates that meaningful personalization creates stronger territorial psychology than purely decorative alternatives. Photos of loved ones, symbols of achievements, objects connected to personal values, or elements representing future goals all provide what psychologists call identity anchoring, environmental reminders that connect work activities to broader life purpose rather than merely making spaces visually appealing. In open-plan offices, open workplaces present particular territorial challenges through reduced physical boundaries and increased sensory exposure. However, research identifies several effective strategies for establishing psychological territory even in highly open configurations. Visual boundaries create what researchers call implied territories without requiring full physical separation. Studies demonstrate that thoughtful placement of items like desktop plants, small screens, or strategically positioned organizers can establish psychological boundaries that others typically respect, despite the absence of walls. These visual elements create what environmental psychologists term perceptual territories that function effectively when organizational culture supports their recognition. Temporal territories involve establishing ownership through consistent usage patterns rather than physical markers. Research shows that regular occupation of the same location, even in hot desking environments, gradually creates what sociologists call use pattern territories that co-workers typically recognize and respect. These temporal territories become particularly effective when combined with subtle physical markers that can be easily deployed and removed as needed, creating recognizable personal domains within shared physical settings. Activity signaling uses behavioral and environmental cues to create what workplace researchers call functional territories, spaces temporarily claimed for specific activities. Studies reveal that simple signals like headphones, particular work tools organized in specific patterns, or distinctive work postures create effective temporary territories by communicating engagement needs. These signals work through what social psychologists call behavioral boundary setting, nonverbal cues that establish temporary territorial claims others generally respect without requiring discussion. In home offices, home workspaces present unique territorial challenges through their integration within domestic environments that serve multiple functions. Effective territorial strategies in home contexts include: spatial dedication involves designating specific areas exclusively for work activities whenever possible. Research demonstrates that workspaces with single-purpose dedication support better attentional focus, clearer work-life boundaries, and more effective transitions between professional and personal modes compared to multi-purpose alternatives. Even modest spatial separation, a specific corner, a dedicated desk, or a room divider creating visual distinction, provides what psychologists call functional cueing that helps the brain register appropriate context for different activities. Temporal boundaries establish territory through consistent time patterns when spatial dedication proves limited. Studies show that maintaining consistent work hours, creating pre-work and post-work rituals that signal transitions, and establishing clear communication about work mode periods helps compensate for reduced spatial boundaries. These temporal practices create what work-life researchers call psychological segmentation that supports territorial clarity despite physical integration. Symbolic demarcation uses visual and practical elements to distinguish work territory from surrounding domestic space. Research indicates that elements like specific lighting used only during work hours, dedicated work tools kept separate from household items, or particular environmental adjustments made only during work periods can create effective psychological territory even in highly integrated spaces. These elements establish what anthropologists call contextual markers that communicate territorial distinctions to both the individual and other household members. Personal territory maintenance and evolution. Beyond initial territory establishment, ongoing territorial maintenance significantly influences workplace psychological health through what researchers call territorial fitness, the ongoing alignment between territorial arrangements and evolving needs. Several strategies support effective territorial evolution. Regular reassessment involves periodically evaluating how well current territorial arrangements serve changing needs and activities. Research shows that workspaces regularly adjusted to maintain alignment with evolving requirements demonstrate better psychological outcomes than static arrangements, regardless of their initial quality. This ongoing adaptation creates what environmental psychologists call dynamic territorial fit, that maintains alignment through iterative adjustments rather than major reconfigurations. Boundary negotiation addresses the inevitable tensions between personal territorial needs and shared space requirements. Studies demonstrate that workplaces with explicit, transparent processes for discussing and adjusting territorial arrangements show better outcomes than environments where these negotiations remain implicit or avoided. These explicit processes support what sociologists call territorial respect culture, shared understanding about how competing territorial needs are balanced within communal contexts. Evolutionary personalization involves gradually refining territorial elements to better reflect developing professional identity and changing work requirements. Research indicates that territories evolving through thoughtful addition and subtraction of elements rather than remaining static or undergoing dramatic overhauls support better psychological outcomes through what identity researchers call environmental continuity with growth, the balance between stability and development that supports healthy professional identity. These territorial maintenance practices recognize that effective workplace territory represents not a fixed achievement, but an ongoing relationship that requires periodic attention and adjustment to remain psychologically supportive. By approaching territory as a dynamic rather than static dimension, you create environments that evolve alongside your developing professional identity and changing work requirements. Sensory well-being in workplace environments. Beyond territorial dimensions, the sensory qualities of workplace environments profoundly influence psychological well-being, cognitive performance, and emotional regulation through what neuroscientists call environmental neuromodulation, the process whereby sensory input directly affects brain function and nervous system state. Understanding these sensory influences allows more conscious creation of workplaces that nourish rather than deplete your psychological resources. Light quality and circadian support. Among all sensory dimensions, light exerts perhaps the most profound influence on workplace psychology through both visual performance effects and deeper biological pathways that regulate alertness, mood, and cognitive function. Research consistently demonstrates that workplaces with adequate natural daylight show significant advantages across multiple psychological measures compared to primarily artificially lit alternatives. Workers with natural daylight access typically demonstrate 10 to 25% better performance on tests requiring sustained attention, approximately 15% fewer reported health complaints, and significantly higher job satisfaction ratings compared to counterparts in identical roles, but with reduced natural light exposure. These advantages emerge through several complementary pathways. Circadian regulation represents light's most fundamental influence, with adequate morning daylight exposure helping synchronize your internal biological clock with external time. This synchronization supports appropriate cortisol and melatonin production cycles that collectively optimize alertness during work hours and sleep quality during rest periods. Disrupted light patterns, particularly inadequate morning brightness or excessive evening blue light exposure, create what chronobiologists call circadian misalignment that undermines both daytime performance and nighttime recovery. Visual processing support emerges through daylight's full-spectrum composition and natural variation patterns. Research demonstrates that tasks performed under lighting conditions that most closely resemble natural daylight typically show fewer errors and reduced visual fatigue compared to activities conducted under limited-spectrum artificial alternatives. These benefits appear particularly pronounced for detail-oriented tasks requiring sustained visual attention and color discrimination. Mood regulation benefits occur through both direct neurological pathways and the psychological associations daylight carries. Studies consistently show correlations between inadequate daylight exposure and increased risk of depressive symptoms, with supplemental bright light interventions showing effectiveness comparable to some pharmacological approaches for mild to moderate seasonal mood issues. These effects appear particularly significant during winter months in high-latitude regions where natural daylight becomes limited. While natural daylight provides optimal benefits, several artificial lighting strategies can significantly enhance workplace psychology when daylight access remains limited. Full-spectrum lighting systems that more closely approximate daylight's spectral composition show advantages over conventional fluorescent or LED alternatives with limited spectral ranges. Research demonstrates that full-spectrum lighting providing balanced wavelength distribution across the visible spectrum correlates with reduced visual fatigue, better color rendering accuracy, and improved subjective well-being ratings compared to lighting with significant spectral gaps. Dynamic lighting systems that change in both intensity and color temperature throughout the day to mimic natural daylight patterns show promising results in workplace applications. Studies indicate that appropriately programmed dynamic lighting, providing cooler, brighter light during morning and midday hours that gradually shifts to warmer, dimmer qualities in late afternoon, can partially compensate for insufficient daylight through supporting circadian regulation despite being indoors. Personalized task lighting that supplements ambient illumination with adjustable individual lights shows significant psychological benefits through what lighting researchers call control premium effects, the enhanced satisfaction that emerges when people can adjust lighting to match personal preferences and task requirements. Research demonstrates that environments providing personal lighting control typically receive higher satisfaction ratings than those with identical average illumination levels but without individual adjustment capacity. These lighting strategies collectively recognize that light functions not merely as a practical utility enabling vision, but as a fundamental biological signal orchestrating numerous psychological processes essential for workplace well-being and performance. By approaching lighting design with this broader understanding, workplaces can support human functioning more comprehensively through thoughtful attention to this crucial environmental dimension. Acoustic management for cognitive support. Sound profoundly influences workplace psychology through effects on attention, stress levels, and communication quality that collectively determine whether acoustic environments support or undermine cognitive performance and emotional well-being. Research consistently demonstrates that poor acoustic conditions rank among the top workplace complaints across diverse organizations, with studies showing that disruptive noise can reduce performance on cognitive tasks by 15 to 30%, depending on noise characteristics and task demands. These performance impacts occur through several distinct mechanisms: Attentional capture occurs when unexpected or information-rich sounds automatically draw cognitive resources away from intended tasks through what neuroscientists call involuntary orientation responses. Studies show that unpredictable sounds, especially those containing recognizable speech or potentially relevant information, create particular disruption through their ability to trigger attention shifts despite conscious attempts to ignore them. Stress activation happens when acoustic conditions trigger the sympathetic nervous system through either excessive volume, unpredictable patterns, or information content perceived as potentially threatening. Research demonstrates that prolonged exposure to stressful acoustic environments increases cortisol production, elevates blood pressure, and creates muscle tension that collectively diminish both cognitive performance and emotional regulation capacity. Masking effects emerge when background sounds interfere with desired acoustic information, particularly speech intelligibility during communication. Studies show that even modest background noise can significantly increase the cognitive effort required for accurate speech perception, creating what audiologists call listening fatigue that depletes mental resources that would otherwise support work activities. Understanding these mechanisms allows more effective acoustic management through strategies that address different aspects of workplace sound environments. Absorption implementation involves adding materials that convert sound energy into heat through friction, effectively removing it from the environment. Research indicates that porous materials with specific density characteristics, acoustic panels, fabric-wrapped absorbers, and specialized acoustic treatments can reduce reverberant noise by 30–80% depending on their coverage and placement. These approaches prove particularly valuable for reducing what acousticians call reflected sound buildup that creates the characteristic echoey quality of undertreated spaces. Barrier utilization involves blocking direct sound transmission between areas through mass, density, and sometimes specialized construction techniques. Studies demonstrate that appropriate barriers can reduce sound transmission by 20 to 30 decibels, depending on their construction, with effectiveness depending significantly on addressing what engineers call flanking paths, indirect routes through which sound travels despite direct path blocking. Sound masking refers to the strategic addition of engineered background sound to cover potentially distracting noises while remaining psychologically acceptable. Research shows that properly implemented masking using specially engineered sound spectra can improve speech privacy by 30 to 40% and reduce reported distraction by 20 to 25% compared to quieter conditions where distracting sounds remain more noticeable. This seemingly paradoxical approach, adding sound to create better acoustic conditions, works through what acousticians call informational masking effects that prevent cognitive processing of potentially distracting information. Beyond these technical approaches, workplace research increasingly recognizes the importance of what acoustic psychologists call soundscape design, comprehensive attention to the complete acoustic experience rather than merely addressing problematic noise. Effective soundscape approaches include acoustic zoning involves organizing activities with different noise requirements and production patterns into appropriate spatial relationships. Research demonstrates that thoughtfully zoned environments, separating meeting areas from focused spaces, providing buffer zones between collaborative and quiet areas, show better acoustic satisfaction ratings than open plans where conflicting acoustic needs create continuous competition for the same sonic territory. Temporal coordination addresses the reality that acoustic needs often vary throughout workdays and weeks. Studies show that establishing shared agreements about appropriate sound levels during different periods, perhaps designating certain hours for collaborative activities and others for focused work requiring greater quiet, can significantly enhance acoustic satisfaction even without physical modifications. Positive sound introduction involves thoughtfully adding beneficial sounds that support psychological well-being rather than merely eliminating problematic noise. Research indicates that certain sound categories, particularly flowing water sounds, gentle nature recordings with appropriate temporal patterns, and specialized ambient compositions designed for acoustic comfort, can enhance both concentration and stress regulation through creating psychologically supportive acoustic backgrounds. These acoustic management approaches collectively recognize that workplace sound represents not merely a technical parameter to minimize, but an active ingredient in psychological experience that requires thoughtful attention across multiple dimensions. By approaching acoustic design comprehensively rather than focusing exclusively on noise reduction, workplaces can support human functioning more effectively through environments that speak appropriately to our remarkably sensitive auditory systems. Biophilic elements and nature connection. Environmental psychology research consistently demonstrates that workplaces incorporating natural elements show significant advantages across multiple psychological measures compared to environments lacking these connections. These benefits emerge through what researchers call biophilic design, approaches that integrate nature contact, natural analogs, and natural patterns into built environments. Studies show remarkably consistent benefits from workplace nature integration, with meta-analyses demonstrating approximately 15% improvement in reported well-being, 6% increase in productivity, and 15% enhancement in creativity in biophilically designed spaces compared to standard alternatives. These effects emerge through several complementary pathways. Stress reduction represents perhaps the most thoroughly documented benefit, with research consistently showing that visual access to natural elements reduces cortisol levels, decreases blood pressure, and lowers heart rate through activation of the parasympathetic nervous system. These physiological changes create what stress researchers call psychological breathing room, capacity to engage with workplace challenges without triggering excessive stress responses that impair both performance and well-being. Attention restoration occurs through what environmental psychologists call soft fascination, the gentle, effortless attention engagement that natural elements provide. Unlike the directed attention required for most work tasks that gradually depletes mental resources, nature connection provides attentional engagement without effort, allowing restoration of cognitive capacity that supports sustained performance across the workday. Positive distraction benefits emerge when natural elements provide brief mental shifts that interrupt rumination, worry, or excessive task focus without creating disruptive distraction. Research demonstrates that occasional glances at natural views or brief interactions with indoor plants provide what psychologists call micro-restoration breaks that refresh mental resources without significantly interrupting workflow. Several research-supported approaches allow effective nature integration across diverse workplace contexts. Visual connection to nature through windows overlooking natural elements represents the most powerful biophilic intervention when available. Studies demonstrate that workers with natural views show approximately 10 to 25% better performance on attention tests, report 15 to 25% fewer headaches, and take approximately 5 to 15% fewer sick days compared to those without such views. When direct outdoor views remain unavailable, research supports benefits from nature photography, digital nature displays with gentle movement, and artistic representations of natural scenes, though these alternatives typically provide about 40 to 60% of the benefit of actual views. Indoor vegetation provides significant benefits even when natural views remain unavailable. Research demonstrates that workplaces incorporating 3 to 5 plants visible from each workstation show measurable improvements in perceived air quality, reported concentration, and stress reduction compared to identical settings without plants. These benefits appear to operate through both actual air quality improvements and psychological association effects that collectively support better cognitive and emotional functioning. Natural materials and patterns extend biophilic benefits through what designers call nature analogs, elements that incorporate natural characteristics without necessarily including living components. Studies show that wood surfaces, stone elements, and materials with natural patterning create measurable reductions in stress markers compared to synthetic alternatives lacking these characteristics. These effects appear particularly pronounced for high-touch surfaces. Elements like desktops, chair arms, or frequently contacted objects where tactile qualities create direct physiological effects through touch perception pathways. Water elements demonstrate especially powerful psychological effects through their multisensory qualities. Research shows that even modest water features in workplace environments, small desktop fountains, aquariums, or digital water displays, reduce stress biomarkers while enhancing reported concentration. These benefits emerge through what sensory researchers call attention holding without depletion. Water's ability to maintain gentle sensory engagement without requiring effortful attention that depletes mental resources. Practical implementation of these biophilic elements involves what researchers call dose-response calibration, providing sufficient nature exposure to create meaningful benefits while respecting space constraints, maintenance requirements, and aesthetic context. Even modest biophilic interventions show measurable effects, with research suggesting that incorporating at least 3 distinct nature elements, ensuring visibility from all primary work positions, and including at least one dynamic natural component, like moving water or plants with gentle movement, creates optimal psychological impact while remaining practical in most workplace contexts. Ergonomics and embodied psychology. While traditional ergonomics focuses primarily on physical dimensions like posture and musculoskeletal impacts, an emerging understanding of embodied cognition recognizes that our physical positioning and movement patterns profoundly influence psychological experience through bidirectional connections between body and mind. This expanded perspective transforms ergonomics from merely preventing physical discomfort into actively supporting psychological well-being through thoughtful attention to how workplaces accommodate human bodies. Beyond pain prevention, the psychology of physical comfort. Research increasingly demonstrates that physical comfort influences psychological processes through multiple pathways, extending far beyond the mere absence of pain or discomfort. Cognitive resource availability increases with physical comfort through what researchers call distraction reduction effects. When your body remains free from discomfort, attentional resources that might otherwise monitor and manage physical issues remain available for work tasks. Studies demonstrate that improvements in physical comfort correlate with approximately 10 to 15% enhancements in sustained attention capacity through these resource conservation mechanisms. Emotional regulation capacity shows sensitivity to physical comfort states, with research indicating that increasing physical discomfort correlates with reduced emotional regulation capability. This connection appears to operate through shared neural resources. Brain regions involved in managing physical discomfort overlap significantly with those regulating emotional responses, creating what neuroscientists call regulatory competition when both systems require simultaneous attention. Cognitive flexibility benefits from comfortable physical states that support what researchers call embodied openness, physical positioning that creates psychological receptivity to new ideas and perspectives. Studies demonstrate that comfortable, balanced postures correlate with greater cognitive flexibility and enhanced creative problem-solving compared to positions creating muscle tension or imbalance. This relationship reflects the bidirectional connection between physical states and thinking patterns established through embodied cognition pathways. These connections highlight why ergonomic considerations extend beyond injury prevention into fundamental support for psychological well-being and cognitive performance. By recognizing this relationship, workplace design can address physical dimensions as active contributors to psychological experience, rather than merely technical parameters to be minimized or managed. Movement integration and postural variation. Perhaps the most significant development in contemporary ergonomics involves recognition that static positioning, even when optimally arranged, creates both physical and psychological costs through what researchers call stillness pathology. Our bodies evolved for varied movement patterns rather than fixed positions, and integrating appropriate movement into workdays provides significant benefits. Cognitive refreshment occurs during postural transitions and brief movement periods through what neuroscientists call neural state shifts, changes in brain activation patterns that help break fixed thinking and support creative insights. Research demonstrates that regular movement breaks correlate with improved problem-solving capacity and reduced mental fatigue compared to continuous stationary work, regardless of posture quality. Mood regulation benefits emerge from movement through its effects on neurotransmitter production and stress hormone management. Studies consistently show that integrating even brief movement periods throughout workdays significantly reduces reported stress levels and enhances positive affect compared to predominantly stationary alternatives. These benefits emerge through both physiological pathways involving endorphin production and psychological effects related to perceived autonomy and environmental change. Attention cycle support represents another movement benefit, with research suggesting that natural human attention follows rhythmic patterns requiring periodic breaks rather than maintaining continuous focus. Studies indicate that brief movement approximately every 30-40 minutes aligns with natural attentional cycles, supporting sustained productivity through what performance researchers call rhythmic renewal, rather than attempting to maintain continuous attention that inevitably deteriorates without breaks. Several research-supported approaches facilitate healthy movement integration. Workstation alternation involves creating options for different working positions, perhaps alternating between seated, standing, and perched postures throughout the day. Research demonstrates that workplaces supporting at least 3 distinct working positions show better psychological outcomes than those limited to single postures, regardless of their ergonomic quality. These benefits emerge through what movement scientists call postural refreshment, the physiological and psychological restoration that occurs through changing physical arrangements. Micro-movement integration addresses the reality that full postural changes aren't always practical by incorporating smaller movements within relatively fixed positions. Studies show benefits from furniture supporting what ergonomists call dynamic sitting, chairs that permit gentle rocking, swiveling, or subtle bouncing motions while maintaining appropriate support. These micro-movement options reduce physical strain while supporting psychological benefits through subtle vestibular stimulation that maintains alertness without requiring conscious attention. Pathway design influences movement through what architects call circulation psychology, how spatial arrangements either encourage or discourage natural movement throughout workdays. Research demonstrates that thoughtfully arranged elements requiring occasional movement, positioning printers, water stations, or reference materials at appropriate distances from primary workspaces, create beneficial movement patterns without disrupting workflow. These design approaches support what behavior scientists call passive intervention effects, environmental elements that naturally encourage healthy behaviors without requiring conscious decision-making. Temporal prompts provide another movement strategy through gentle reminders to change position or incorporate brief activity. Studies show that electronic notifications, environmental cues, or social agreements supporting regular movement significantly increase movement integration compared to relying solely on physical setup or individual intention. These prompts work through what behavior change researchers call implementation triggers, specific cues that activate intended behaviors without requiring continuous conscious effort. Personal control and ergonomic adaptation. Beyond specific physical arrangements, research consistently demonstrates the profound psychological value of what ergonomists call adjustment capacity, the ability to modify workplace physical elements according to changing needs and preferences. This control dimension often proves more significant than any particular ergonomic configuration through its effects on both physical comfort and psychological well-being. Perceived control benefits emerge when people can adjust their physical environments, with research showing that identical physical arrangements receive significantly higher comfort ratings when users can modify them compared to when the same configurations remain fixed despite being ergonomically identical. This control premium reflects what psychologists call environmental self-efficacy, the confidence that you can influence your surroundings to meet your needs. Adaptability to individual variation represents another control advantage, acknowledging that human bodies demonstrate remarkable diversity that standardized arrangements cannot adequately accommodate. Studies show that adjustable systems allowing personalization to individual anthropometrics, movement preferences, and working styles show approximately 15 to 25% higher satisfaction ratings than fixed alternatives designed for average users, a statistical abstraction that matches virtually no actual individuals. Temporal adaptation support emerges when physical arrangements can evolve throughout the day to match changing activities and energy states. Research demonstrates that workplaces facilitating easy transitions between different working modes, focused individual work, collaborative engagement, creative exploration, restorative breaks, show better psychological outcomes than environments optimized for single functions, regardless of their ergonomic quality within that narrow optimization. Several approaches support effective ergonomic control implementation. Intuitive adjustment mechanisms significantly determine whether theoretical adjustability translates into actual adaptation. Research shows that adjustment features requiring minimal effort, providing clear feedback, and operating without specialized knowledge receive approximately 3 times more frequent use than equally functional alternatives with less intuitive interfaces. This usage difference highlights the importance of what human factors specialists call adjustment affordances, physical and visual cues that communicate how modification works without requiring instruction. Adjustment education provides another essential dimension, with studies demonstrating that brief education about how and why to adjust ergonomic elements increases subsequent adjustment frequency by 30 to 50%, compared to providing identical equipment without guidance. This education works best when covering both mechanical operation and the underlying benefits of adaptation, creating what learning scientists call motivated implementation, action driven by understanding of purpose rather than merely following instructions. Social permission structures address the reality that workplace culture significantly influences adjustment behavior beyond mechanical capability. Research shows that environments where leaders visibly model adjustment, organizational communications explicitly support personalization, and social norms encourage adaptation show significantly higher rates of ergonomic control utilization compared to contexts where adjustment capacity exists but remains socially unmarked or implicitly discouraged. These control dimensions highlight why effective ergonomics involves not just providing technically appropriate equipment, but creating psychological and social conditions that support active adaptation to individual needs. By recognizing this broader context, workplace designers can create environments that support genuine ergonomic engagement, rather than merely meeting technical specifications that may remain underutilized without proper implementation support. Creating supportive home offices. The dramatic increase in remote work has transformed countless homes into workplaces, creating both unique challenges and opportunities for psychological environment design. Unlike traditional workplaces with standardized approaches and professional management, home offices typically evolve through individual decisions within existing domestic spaces that serve multiple functions. This context requires distinctive strategies for creating psychologically supportive work environments. Effective work-home boundary establishment. Perhaps the most fundamental psychological challenge of home-based work involves establishing appropriate boundaries between professional and personal domains. Spatial, temporal, and psychological borders that help maintain work engagement while preventing excessive blending that undermines both productivity and well-being. Research identifies several effective boundary strategies. Spatial dedication creates what environmental psychologists call functional territories, areas exclusively or primarily designated for work activities that provide clear distinction from spaces serving other purposes. Studies demonstrate that home workers with dedicated workspace report approximately 15 to 25% better attention maintenance, clearer psychological transitions between work and personal modes, and reduced work-life conflict compared to those working in multi-purpose areas without clear spatial designation. This dedication doesn't necessarily require separate rooms. Research shows that even clearly defined zones within shared spaces provide significant benefits through what designers call micro-environmental differentiation, distinct sensory characteristics that signal different functions despite proximity. Effective spatial markers include furniture arrangements creating visual separation, lighting changes that distinguish work zones, or even decorative elements that visually signal territory transitions between work and non-work areas. Temporal boundaries complement spatial strategies through clear delineation of when work occurs versus when domestic life takes precedence. Studies indicate that home workers maintaining consistent work schedules with defined start/finish rituals report better attentional focus during work periods and more complete psychological detachment during non-work time compared to those with inconsistent temporal boundaries. These schedule structures operate through what chronopsychologists call temporal entrainment, the tendency for regular timing patterns to create predictable psychological states associated with specific time periods. Effective temporal boundaries typically involve what transition researchers call boundary rituals, consistent activities marking shifts between work and personal domains, morning routines that signal work commencement, midday transitions that maintain domain separation during breaks, and evening activities that definitively conclude professional engagement collectively create psychological clarity that supports both work performance and personal recovery. Social agreements represent another crucial boundary dimension, with research demonstrating that home workers who establish clear understanding with household members about work parameters, when interruptions are acceptable, how to signal unavailability, and what constitutes appropriate background activity during work periods, report significantly less role conflict and better attentional management than those operating without such agreements. These social contracts work through what family therapists call explicit expectation alignment, shared understanding that prevents the frustration and conflict emerging from incompatible unspoken assumptions. Effective social boundary management typically involves periodic reassessment through what communication researchers call boundary renegotiation conversations, discussions that adjust agreements as circumstances change, rather than maintaining fixed rules that may become misaligned with evolving needs. This adaptability supports what work-life researchers call sustainable boundary maintenance, systems that bend without breaking as requirements shift over time. Sensory management in home workspaces. Home environments often present distinctive sensory challenges compared to traditional workplaces, from domestic noise patterns to residential lighting designed for relaxation rather than task performance. Addressing these sensory dimensions requires targeted strategies. Lighting optimization proves particularly important in home offices that typically lack the standardized illumination systems of commercial workplaces. Research demonstrates that home workers who implement layered lighting, combining ambient illumination with dedicated task lighting and appropriate natural light management, report approximately 15 to 20% less visual fatigue and better sustained attention compared to those relying solely on existing residential lighting designed primarily for comfort rather than task performance. Effective home office lighting typically involves what lighting designers call task ambient accent layering, combining functional illumination for specific work requirements with appropriate background lighting and elements creating visual interest without distraction. This approach recognizes that psychological well-being requires both adequate task visibility and broader sensory nourishment through balanced visual environments. Acoustic management addresses what audio researchers call the residential soundscape challenge. Home acoustic patterns typically featuring intermittent domestic noise rather than the steady ambient sound of traditional workplaces. Studies show that home workers implementing appropriate sound management strategies, including sound masking, acoustic absorption, background sound introduction, and communication technology optimization, demonstrate better concentration, reduced stress, and more professional communication experiences compared to those working within unmodified residential acoustic environments. Effective acoustic approaches for home offices typically involve what sound specialists term multi-mechanism management, combining physical elements like room absorption materials with technological tools such as noise-canceling headphones and behavioral strategies, including household agreements about sound generation during work periods. This comprehensive approach addresses the reality that home acoustic challenges typically require multiple complementary solutions rather than single interventions. Air quality and temperature represent often overlooked dimensions where residential settings may differ significantly from commercial environments optimized for productivity. Research indicates that home workers who actively manage these factors, maintaining appropriate ventilation, monitoring carbon dioxide levels, and ensuring temperature ranges supporting cognitive function, typically 68 to 72 degrees, 22 degrees C for analytical tasks, demonstrate better sustained cognitive performance compared to those working in residential conditions optimized for comfort or energy efficiency rather than productivity. Practical approaches typically involve what environmental health specialists call microenvironment management, creating appropriately conditioned work zones without necessarily altering entire residential settings. Desktop air purifiers, localized heating, cooling options, appropriate ventilation procedures, and strategic use of plants for both psychological and air quality benefits collectively create what environmental researchers call work-supportive microclimate zones within broader residential settings. Technological integration and management. Technology integration creates distinctive psychological challenges in home workspaces, where boundaries between professional tools, personal devices, and household systems often blur. Effective management requires intentional strategies. Equipment separation involves maintaining distinct technological boundaries between professional and personal digital domains. Research demonstrates that home workers who establish clear separation, dedicated work devices, separate accounts for professional versus personal use, distinct storage systems for work materials, report better attentional focus during work periods, and more complete psychological detachment during non-work time compared to those with highly integrated technological ecosystems. This separation creates what cognitive scientists call context-specific activation patterns, neurological states associated with particular activities and tools that support appropriate psychological engagement for different domains. By maintaining technological distinctiveness between work and personal life, you establish what information researchers term cognitive domain markers that help your brain register appropriate engagement modes for different activities. Digital boundary management addresses the reality that contemporary work often extends beyond physical devices to include information ecosystems, notification systems, and communication channels that can easily infiltrate personal time and space. Studies show that home workers implementing explicit digital boundaries, scheduled notification pauses, deliberate application closures at day's end, separate professional and personal communication channels, demonstrate healthier psychological transitions and better recovery compared to those maintaining continuous digital availability. Effective approaches typically involve what technology researchers call intentional friction introduction, deliberately creating small barriers between work and personal digital domains that require conscious choice to cross. These friction points serve as what behavior scientists term pattern interrupts. moments that break automatic behavior chains and create opportunities for conscious choice about domain boundaries. Ergonomic technology integration recognizes that home offices often lack the specialized equipment of traditional workplaces, creating risks for both physical and psychological well-being. Research indicates that home workers who implement appropriate ergonomic technology solutions, properly positioned screens, external input devices supporting neutral postures, appropriate visual display management, report significantly less physical discomfort and better sustained cognitive performance compared to those using consumer-grade equipment in configurations designed for brief rather than extended use. Practical approaches involve what ergonomists call hybrid adaptation, combining purpose-designed professional equipment for high-impact elements with creative adaptation of residential items for secondary functions. This approach acknowledges the reality that most home offices operate with resource constraints requiring thoughtful prioritization rather than comprehensive professional outfitting, creating home office resilience. Beyond specific environmental elements, successful home workspaces require what psychologists call environmental resilience, the capacity to maintain psychological support despite changing circumstances and inevitable constraints. Several strategies support this resilience. Flexibility planning involves deliberately designing home workspaces to adapt to changing requirements, household needs, and personal preferences. Research demonstrates that home offices incorporating modular elements, multi-function components, and easily reconfigurable layouts demonstrate better sustainability through what adaptation researchers call environmental responsiveness, the capacity to evolve alongside changing work requirements rather than becoming obsolete as needs shift. Effective approaches typically involve what designers call scenario planning, considering multiple potential use patterns during initial setup rather than optimizing exclusively for current conditions. This forward-looking approach creates what environmental psychologists term adaptive capacity, built-in flexibility that accommodates change without requiring complete reconfiguration when circumstances shift. Resource prioritization addresses the reality that most home offices operate with constraints, limited space, budget restrictions, competing household needs, requiring thoughtful decisions about where to invest resources for maximum psychological benefit. Studies indicate that home workers who prioritize investments based on frequency of interaction and psychological impact, rather than merely aesthetic or technical considerations, report higher workspace satisfaction and better sustained performance. Research suggests focusing resources on what ergonomists call high-interaction elements, the specific environmental components you engage with most frequently and intensively. Quality seating that supports proper posture during hours of daily use, appropriate lighting in primary task areas, and effective acoustic management typically provide greater psychological return than visually impressive but less functionally critical elements. Continuous refinement practices involve ongoing assessment and adjustment of home workspaces rather than considering arrangement a one-time project. Studies show that home workers who implement regular environmental reviews, perhaps monthly or quarterly evaluations of how well their workspace serves changing needs, report better long-term satisfaction and fewer accumulated stressors compared to those who establish initial setups without subsequent refinement. Effective approaches involve what improvement specialists call iterative micro-adjustments, small, continuous refinements based on actual experience rather than infrequent major overhauls. This ongoing process creates what environmental psychologists term evolutionary fit, gradually increasing alignment between workspace characteristics and actual needs through accumulated small improvements rather than dramatic redesigns. Conclusion: the environmental practice of work. As we conclude our exploration of workplace environmental psychology, remember that creating truly supportive work environments represents not a one-time achievement, but an ongoing practice, a continuous conversation between your evolving needs and the spaces that contain your professional activities. Like any meaningful practice, this relationship deepens through attention, intention, and regular renewal as circumstances change. The environments where we work, whether corporate offices, shared spaces, or home settings, shape our experience far more profoundly than most organizational discussions acknowledge. Beyond mere containers for productivity, these spaces actively participate in our thinking patterns, emotional states, relational dynamics, and physical well-being through constant sensory conversations that operate largely outside conscious awareness while profoundly influencing both performance and personal thriving. By bringing greater consciousness to these environmental relationships, you transform from passive occupant to active curator of spaces aligned with both professional objectives and personal well-being. This awareness need not require dramatic renovation or significant resource investment. Often the most powerful interventions involve modest adjustments thoughtfully aligned with genuine psychological needs rather than merely following design trends or technical specifications disconnected from human experience. The environmental practice of work ultimately recognizes that our surroundings represent not merely technical parameters to optimize, but essential ingredients in the recipe of meaningful engagement. Through conscious attention to the spaces that contain our professional lives, we discover opportunities to create environments that don't just house our work, but actively nourish the complex human beings performing it, supporting not merely what we produce, but who we become through the hours we spend engaged in purposeful activity.